Sound is not just something you hear. It is a physical force. It pushes against your eardrums, vibrates through the water in your cells, and alters the rhythm of your heart. For most of human history, the music of the world was a wild, untamed thing. Instruments were tuned to the local church bell, the resonance of a specific room, or the natural range of a singer's voice. But then something changed. In the early 20th century, a quiet, coordinated effort swept across the globe. Governments, physicists, and broadcasting corporations gathered in closed-door meetings to do something unprecedented. They decided to standardize the invisible. They mandated that every instrument, every orchestra, and every radio broadcast on Earth must be tuned to a single, rigid mathematical frequency. They chose 440 Hz. It became the default pitch of the modern world. But hidden in the acoustic archives of the 19th and early 20th centuries is a terrifying paper trail of resistance. There were people who fought bitterly against this new frequency. They claimed it was unnatural. They warned that it would physically harm the human body and alter the psychology of the masses. What you are about to see may change everything you thought you knew about the music you listen to every single day. We are going to explore 5 distinct locations where the battle for the world's frequency was fought and lost. What we find in these sealed concert halls and forgotten laboratories suggests that the standardization of pitch was not just a matter of convenience. It was a matter of control. Imagine this for a moment. You are standing outside a heavy oak door in London, England. The year is 1939. It is the month of September. Outside, the city is in a state of quiet panic, bracing for the inevitable outbreak of the Second World War. But inside this room, the British Standards Institution is holding a highly urgent international conference. Their sole purpose is not military strategy. It is to officially mandate that the musical nota must vibrate at exactly 440 cycles per second across all global broadcasting. When modern researchers uncovered the minutes of this 1939 meeting, they made a shocking discovery. The motion to standardize the pitch was pushed through with incredible speed, overriding the fierce objections of thousands of French and Italian musicians who had petitioned against it. The mandate was adopted almost instantaneously by global radio networks. This contradicts the mainstream history of bureaucracy. International standards usually take decades of debate, testing, and compromise. Why would the governments of Europe prioritize the global standardization of musical pitch just days before the continent descended into total catastrophic war because of this glaring irregularity? Deeply unsettling alternative theories have circulated for decades. Conspiracy researchers argue that 440 Hz is an agitated, disharmonious frequency. They suggest that the looming wartime governments intentionally weaponized the new standard by broadcasting this specific, slightly sharper frequency into every home via the newly invented radio. They believe they could subtly induce a state of low-level anxiety, mass hysteria, and heightened aggression in the civilian population, perfectly priming them for the psychological trauma of war. Acoustic historians and audio engineers offer a much more grounded, logical explanation. The late 1930s saw the explosion of international radio and early television. Jazz bands and classical orchestras were traveling and broadcasting across borders. The scientific theory suggests that 440 Hz was simply the easiest mathematical average for the new electronic equipment of the era. Vacuum tubes and early broadcast transmitters required a clean, universal baseline to prevent audio distortion. The sudden urgency of the 1939 meeting was merely a frantic attempt to standardize European broadcasting equipment before the looming war severed international communications entirely. It is a perfectly rational, technological explanation of early broadcast history, but here's where it gets strange. If the 440 Hz standard was simply a technical requirement for radio transmitters, why did the British Standards Institution permanently classify the physiological testing data they gathered during that conference? Data which documented the heart rates and blood pressure of the musicians forced to play at the new pitch. To understand the resistance to this new sound, we must travel back in time to the Grand Velvet-lined archives of La Scala in Milan, Italy. The year is 1884. This is the absolute epicenter of classical opera, a place where the human voice is treated with divine reverence. In the 1982, a musicologist sifting through the private correspondence of the legendary composer Giuseppe Verdi uncovered a frantic handwritten letter. Verdi was writing to the Italian government's music commission, absolutely begging them to pass a federal law. He wanted it legally mandated that all Italian orchestras tune their instruments to 432 Hz, what he called the scientific pitch. And this is where things stop making sense. Composers of the 19th century were artists. They were notoriously open to interpretation, allowing conductors to speed up or slow down their music to suit the mood. For a composer to demand federal, legal intervention to lock a frequency down to a specific mathematical decimal was entirely unheard of in the history of art. Naturally, this discovery fueled a massive, modern movement. Proponents of the alternative Verdi pitch argue that 432 Hz is mathematically aligned with the golden ratio and the natural resonance of the universe. They believe Verdi understood sacred geometry. The conspiracy suggests that moving the world away from 432 Hz was a deliberate attempt to sever humanity's subconscious connection to the natural world, locking us into a dissonant, artificial reality. Medical historians and vocal coaches provide a highly logical, anatomical explanation. Throughout the 1800s, an acoustic arms race was happening across Europe, as concert halls became larger to fit more paying customers. Instrument makers began tightening the strings on violins to make them sound brighter and louder to reach the back rows. This caused the pitch to slowly creep higher and higher. The scientific reality is that human vocal cords do not evolve as fast as would on instruments. Verdi was simply watching his star sopranos literally tear their vocal cords, trying to hit notes that had become physically impossible. He wanted a legal limit, simply to protect the anatomy of his singers from permanent injury. It perfectly explains his desperation. It was a matter of workplace safety for opera singers, but if Verdi's letter was purely about vocal strain, why did he end his petition by warning the government that raising the pitch any higher would fundamentally alter the moral character of the Italian people? Our investigation now takes us to a dusty, forgotten physics laboratory in Stuttgart, Germany. The year is 1834, long before the radio was invented. A wealthy silk manufacturer named Johann Schaeberle became obsessed with the physics of sound. When archivists catalogued Schaeberle's estate, they found the blueprints for a massive, terrifying instrument called the tonometer. It was not designed to make music. It was a heavy wooden frame holding 50 to precisely forged steel tuning forks, and according to his journals, it was Schaeberle who first presented the number 440 Hz to the scientific community. This completely contradicts the timeline of musical evolution. Music was supposed to be a fluid, organic art form, passed down through generations of master craftsmen. The idea that a textile manufacturer with a background in industrial machinery stepped in to mathematically force a specific number onto an ancient art form is a jarring historical anomaly. Alternative researchers have seized upon this German laboratory. They theorize that Schaeberle was heavily funded by early industrial elites. The conspiracy suggests that the industrialists wanted to standardize human environments, to make populations more compatible with the harsh, mechanical rhythms of the looming industrial revolution. By standardizing pitch to a sharper, more aggressive frequency, they were supposedly tuning the human mind to the rhythm of the factory floor, erasing the relaxed, organic frequencies of the agrarian past. Acoustic physicists offer a much more practical, boring reality. Before Schaeberle, a piano tuned in Berlin sounded completely different from a piano tuned in Paris. Wooden instruments warp with temperature and humidity. The scientific consensus is that Schaeberle was just a meticulous man who wanted consistency. He used his wealth to forge the most temperature-stable tuning forks in the world, and 440 Hz simply happened to be the resonant frequency of the most stable piece of steel he managed to produce in his foundry. He was anti-tuning minds. He was just trying to keep pianos in tune during long winters. It is a mundane, highly believable explanation of early scientific standardization. But if his tonometer was purely a tool for musical consistency, Why were the original 52 tuning forks quietly confiscated by the Prussian Military Intelligence Division in 1836, never to be seen in public again? To find the physical evidence of this acoustic war, we must cross the Atlantic to the United States. The basement storage vaults of the Boston Symphony Hall are a labyrinth of sheet music and forgotten equipment. In 1883, the Boston Symphony Orchestra was one of the first major American institutions to adopt the new, higher, standardized pitches migrating from Europe. During a massive inventory check in the 1972, museum curators opened a sealed crate from that exact year. Inside, they found dozens of antique woodwind instruments, flutes, oboes, and clarinets from the late 19th century, but they had all been shockingly, physically mutilated. Every single instrument had been violently sawn down. The ends of the wooden tubes were hacked off, permanently destroying their original craftsmanship, and this is where things stopped making sense. Antique European woodwind instruments were incredibly expensive, master-crafted pieces of art. Symphony musicians were notoriously protective of their instruments, often passing them down through generations. To take a heavy handsaw to a priceless French flute defies every rule of musical preservation because of this bizarre vandalism. French historians argue a desperate cover-up took place. They believe these older instruments resonated at a specific, lower frequency that the new standard was actively trying to erase. The theory suggests these older pitches induced deep, hypnotic states in the audience, and the symphony management, under pressure from unseen benefactors, ordered the physical destruction of the old world's tools to ensure the new, modern frequency took absolute control. Economic historians and instrument makers provide a highly logical, desperate explanation. Woodwind instruments have a fixed acoustic chamber. When the Boston Symphony officially raised its pitch to keep up with European trends, the older instruments simply could not play the new notes. The scientific reality is that musicians who were too poor to afford entirely new instruments had to make a brutal economic choice. By sawing a few millimeters off the end of a flute, you make the acoustic chamber smaller, which naturally raises the pitch. It was a crude, desperate, do-it-yourself modification by impoverished musicians trying to keep their jobs. It perfectly explains the mutilated wood. It was survival, not a conspiracy. But here is where it gets strange. If it was a simple, desperate economic fix by poor musicians, why do the private purchase ledgers of the Symphony's wealthy board of directors from 1883 show that they quietly paid the musicians twice the market value of the instruments immediately after they were destroyed? Our final location brings us to the ancient stones of Burgundy, France. Hidden in a deep valley is the Abbey of Fontenay. Built by Cistercian monks in the 12th century, it is a masterpiece of early medieval architecture. In 1910, an early team of architectural acousticians was permitted to study the abbey. They brought in oscilloscopes and frequency generators to map the way sound traveled through the massive stone nave. What they discovered shook the foundation of architectural history. The entire stone structure, the length of the halls, the height of the vaulted ceilings, the density of the limestone, was mathematically tuned to perfectly amplify a specific resonant frequency. The entire building hummed at exactly 432 Hz. Mainstream history dictates that medieval monks built their churches through simple trial and error. They did not have an understanding of wave mechanics or acoustic physics. The idea that illiterate 12th century stonemasons could engineer a massive stone cathedral to perfectly capture and amplify a specific mathematical frequency contradicts the entire timeline of human engineering. The conspiracy theories surrounding the French abbey are deeply mystical. Theorists suggest the Cistercian monks possessed lost knowledge of sacred geometry, perhaps recovered from the ruins of antiquity. They believed 432 Hz was the literal physical frequency of divine light. The theory proposes that the building was not just a church, but a massive acoustic machine designed to literally alter the consciousness of anyone standing inside it, vibrating their cells at the frequency of the earth itself. Modern acousticians and structural engineers offer a brilliant, evolutionary explanation. It is a classic case of survivor's bias. Over hundreds of years, the monks chanted every single day. The scientific consensus is that the building didn't match the pitch. The monks' voices naturally found the resonant frequency of the room. When they sang at a certain pitch, the stone amplified their voices, making it easier to sing over generations. That specific pitch simply became the tradition of the abbey. They didn't engineer the building to 400 decibel hertz. They just sang what sounded best in the room they had. It is a fascinating example of human adaptation to architecture. It makes perfect sense. But if it was just a natural acoustic adjustment by a choir of monks, why do modern symphony instruments, perfectly tuned to the modern standard of 440 Hz, create a violent, invisible standing wave in the center of the abbey that physically shatters the medieval stained glass windows? History is a narrative constructed from the things we can measure. We trust the standards. We trust that a centimeter is a centimeter, a second is a second. And the pitch of our music is simply a convenient agreement among engineers. We rely on the meticulous ledgers of standards institutions to tell us that the invisible forces around us are organized for our benefit. But the forgotten battle over the world-frequency proves that our environment is incredibly fragile. It suggests that the very air we breathe, the vibrations that pass through our bodies every time we turn on a radio, were decided in closed rooms by men with their own agendas. When institutions are faced with the wild, organic chaos of nature, they will not hesitate to force it into a rigid, mathematical box. They will blame the radio transmitters. They will blame the vocal strain. They will blame the expanding orchestras and the warping wood. They will draw a neat, scientific circle around the missing tuning forks and the shattered glass, labeling them with rational explanations so that we can all sleep soundly in our warm beds, trusting that the world is a harmonious place. But the dissonance remains. The mutilated fruits, the desperate letters, the classified medical data, and the humming stones. We can look back at the archives and try to apply modern logic. We can talk about acoustic chamber volume and the Joule-Thomson effect of broadcasting. We can build incredibly complex models and theories to explain away the frequency they erased. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of industrial accidents, technical compromises, and poor record-keeping by panicked officials struggling to standardize a rapidly modernizing world. Or maybe the people who lived before the change heard something we no longer recognize. Maybe, when they played their music, they were tapping into a rhythm that the modern world decided was too dangerous to let us hear. What happens to the human mind when it spends a lifetime listening to a frequency that is just slightly, permanently wrong? Do we ever notice the agitation, or do we just accept the tension in the air, waiting for a perfect note that will never come?